collector stands in a gallery on Bond Street in the spring of 1880, holding a small framed oil painting up toward the window light, and what he is looking at is the River Thames at dawn. The painting is barely a foot wide. It shows the water as a long, silvered smear of grey and violet, the far bank dissolved into fog the colour of a pigeon's wing, and somewhere in the middle distance a string of barges rides at anchor with their reflections trembling underneath them. There is a smudge of ochre along the bottom edge of the canvas, low-tide mud catching the first thin light, and if you look closely, and the collector does not, there are 3 or 4 tiny dark figures worked into that smudge with a single loaded brush, bent low, barely more than commas of paint against the mud. The dealer selling the piece calls it a nocturne in the fashionable manner of the day and tells the collector it captures something true about the river that no photograph could manage, its poetry, its hush, the way London's oldest working artery becomes, for 1 hour at dawn almost holy to look at. The collector agrees. He will hang it in his study, where it will be admired for exactly the qualities the dealer named, and where the 3 or 4 commas of paint bent over in the mud will never once, in the entire life of that painting, be the thing anyone in the room is looking at. This is London, 1880, and the river running through the middle of it is, by any measure the newspapers care to print, a triumph. Sir Joseph Bazalgette's great sewers, more than 1,000 miles of them, have pulled the worst of the city's filth out of the open air and off the surface of the water where it used to sit and rot. The embankment stands granite and gaslit along both banks in the fashionable stretches, admired by the very sort of person who might buy a small painting of it for his study. The Thames of 1880 is, in the version most Londoners carry in their heads, a solved problem, a picturesque backdrop, the kind of thing an artist paints for its beauty rather than its danger. Under that silvered surface, twice every single day, without fail, according to a clock that answers to the moon and not to the calendar of any human institution, the river drops away and leaves behind a different London entirely. Acres of exposed mud stretch out along both banks where the water stood an hour before, black and cold and studded with everything the largest city on earth has thrown, dropped, spilled, flushed, or lost into its only major waterway. And onto that mud, before the light is even fully up, walk the people the painting reduced to 3 brushstrokes and the century mostly declined to look at directly at all. Barefoot children. Old women bent nearly double. A population the Victorian public called, when it thought of them at all, mudlarks, and mostly did not think of them at all. This is the story the nocturne never told, the one underneath the fog and the silver water and the ochre smudge along the bottom edge of the canvas, and it is far more complicated, far more uncomfortable, and far more human than any painting of the Thames was ever built to show you. This is the Thames foreshore in the year 1880, and every single low tide, twice a day, for 6 hours at a stretch. Hundreds of Londoners who own almost nothing walk down onto the exposed mud of the largest, filthiest, most productive river in the world and go to work. Not metaphorical work, not a picturesque livelihood glimpsed from a bridge. Real labour, performed with bare hands and bare feet in conditions that would today be classified, without argument, as a public health emergency requiring immediate evacuation. They are searching for anything the river or the city above it has let fall. Lumps of coal dropped from a collier's shovel, scraps of old rope worth pennies to a rag shop, a copper nail, a length of chain, a bone. It is, by the account of the one man who bothered to document it with any seriousness, one of the hardest and least rewarded trades an English child could be born into, and it existed in the full view of a city that mostly agreed, without ever quite saying so out loud, not to look at it too closely. This video is that closer look, not the sanitized version, the misty word mudlark that survives today, mostly as a hobbyist's term for weekend collectors, combing the same foreshore for Tudor buttons and clay pipes with a permit in their pocket and a warm bed waiting at home. The real one. Sewage that Bazalgette's brilliant, unfinished system still let loose into this stretch of tidal river on the wrong day and the wrong tide. Industrial poison draining straight off the gasworks and the tanneries lining both banks. Broken glass and rusted iron capable of opening a child's foot to the bone. A tide that returns every 6 hours, whether or not the person standing in its path has noticed the time. And underneath all of that, an economy so merciless in its arithmetic that a good day's find, gathered at the risk of a child's life, bought a family perhaps a loaf of bread and a night's floor space in a lodging house, and a bad day bought nothing at all. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of history that interests you, the version underneath the museum caption and the misty painting, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps this channel keep doing the research these stories deserve. And if tonight's story catches you somewhere you did not expect, leave a word in the comments about it. I do read them, and I am always glad to know which corners of the past people want uncovered next. Let us begin then, the way every Mudlark's day actually began, in the dark, in the cold, with a child listening for the sound of water pulling back from a doorstep. Her name, for the purposes of this story, is Ada Pell, and in the spring of 1880 she is 9 years old, small even for 9, with the particular thinness that comes not from any single hunger, but from years of meals that were never quite enough, spread out evenly enough that nobody in her family would call it starving. She lives with her mother, her father when he is working, and 3 younger brothers and sisters in a single room on the 2nd floor of a court off Jacob Street in Bermondsey, on the south bank of the Thames, a stone's throw from the tanneries whose smell the whole district carries in its walls and its washing and, if you asked anyone who had lived there long enough, in the taste of its water. Her father, Tom Pell, is a casual labourer at the wharves when there is work to be had, paid by the day and sometimes by the hour, a man whose income her mother, Bridget, has learned never to plan a week's meals around, because the docks along this stretch of river hire men the way a card player deals a hand, generously on some mornings and not at all on others, and a labourer with a bad back or an employer's bad mood can find himself with nothing to bring home for a fortnight at a stretch. Ada's body, if a stranger were to look past the layers of patched and hand-me-down clothing she wears against the cold, tells its own quiet story. She is missing part of one fingernail on her left hand, lost 2 years ago to a shard of glass she never saw coming and did not think worth mentioning to her mother until the finger had gone an alarming shade of red. There is a scar along the outer edge of her right foot, thin and pale now, from a rusted nail that went ½ an inch into the sole of her foot the previous winter and kept her from walking properly for the better part of 3 weeks. 3 weeks in which her family's income from the foreshore, always thin, went to almost nothing. She has a cough that worsens every winter and eases every summer in the particular rhythm her mother has learned to recognize and has stopped, mostly worrying over, because every child on the court has some version of the same cough, and worrying over what cannot be changed is a luxury Bridget Pell has never been able to afford. What Ada has, that her mother finds almost unbearably touching and has never told her so, is a small tin box, an old tobacco tin gone soft and rust spotted at the corners, in which she keeps the objects she finds on the foreshore that are worth nothing to anyone but her. A blue glass bead, half of a clay pipe bowl with a face pressed into it, a brass button stamped with a design she cannot read but likes the look of. None of it will ever be sold. It is, in a life with almost no room in it for anything that is simply hers, the one collection Ada Pell keeps for no reason at all except that she wants to. This particular morning, a Tuesday in April, the tide is due to turn against the mud at a little after 4, and Ada is awake before it, the way she has been awake before every low tide since she was 6 years old and her mother first judged her old enough and more usefully small enough to go down onto the foreshore herself. If you imagine what it might have felt like to scavenge along a riverbank in old London, you probably picture something closer to today's version of the word mudlark, a hobbyist in rubber waders and a permit from the Port of London Authority, combing the foreshore on a Saturday morning with a metal detector, hoping to turn up a Tudor coin or a clay pipe stem to photograph and post online before going home to a hot bath and a warm dinner. That version exists now, and it is a genuinely pleasant way to spend a weekend. It has almost nothing in common with what the word meant in 1880, when nobody who did this work would have recognized it as a hobby, a pastime, or anything resembling a choice freely made. In the London of Ada Pell's childhood, the Mudlarks were, by the estimate of the one investigator who counted them with any rigor, somewhere between 800 and 1,000 people working the tidal Thames on a regular basis, concentrated most heavily along the stretches nearest the docks, the wharves, and the coal barges where the river's daily traffic was most likely to drop something worth finding. That investigator was a journalist and social researcher named Henry Mayhew, who spent much of the 1840s gathering material for what became London Labour and the London Poor, walking the foreshore himself, notebook in hand, talking to the people other Londoners preferred not to look at directly, and setting down what he found in a level of detail that makes his account. More than a century and a half later, still the single most important surviving record of who these people actually were. What Mayhew found, and what remained essentially true through the decades that followed, including the year this story is set in, was a workforce made up almost entirely of two groups: children, some as young as 5 or 6, and the elderly poor, men and women in their 60s and 70s for whom every other form of paid work had closed, one door at a time, until the foreshore was what remained. There was very little in between. A working adult in the prime of life could usually find some other trade, no matter how hard, that paid better than mud. It was the very old and the very young who were left with nothing else, which is a fact worth sitting with for a moment, because it means the population wading into the coldest, filthiest, most dangerous water in London twice a day was, disproportionately and by simple economic necessity, made up of the two groups least equipped to survive what that water actually contained. Ada rises this particular Tuesday in the dark, in a room she shares with her mother, her father when he is home, and her 3 younger siblings, none of whom stir as she dresses. There is no clock in the room, and Ada has never been taught to read one in any case. But she does not need one. She has learned the tide the way her mother learned it before her and her grandmother before that, not from a printed almanac, but from a kind of inherited instinct, checked against the moon when it is visible and against the particular sound the river makes from 2 streets away when it is not. A sound that changes in a way Ada could not fully explain to anyone who asked, but that she has never once gotten wrong. She pulls on a dress that was her mother's a decade earlier, cut down and taken in, and over it a shawl too thin for the April cold, and she does not put on shoes. Because she does not own any that would survive an hour on the foreshore, and because bare feet, whatever else can be said against them, let her feel her way across the mud in the dark, far better than any boot she has ever owned or borrowed. She meets old Sarah at the top of the water stairs, a set of worn stone steps leading down from the street to the foreshore that every mudlark on this stretch of the river uses, and that generations of Bermondsey families before them used for exactly the same purpose. Sarah Coyle is somewhere past 60, a widow whose husband spent 30 years working the same docks Tom Pell now works on the good weeks, and who has been coming down these stairs at every low tide, in every season, for longer than Ada has been alive. It was Sarah who first walked Ada out onto the mud 4 years ago, holding her hand, showing her where to place her feet and where never to place them, and it is Sarah, more than either of Ada's parents, who has taught her nearly everything she actually knows about how to survive this work. The two of them do not speak much on the walk down. There is not a great deal to say at 3:30 in the morning that either of them has not said 100 times before, and conversation, in any case, is a thing best saved for daylight, when the tide is out and the two of them are not straining to hear the water in the dark. What waits for them at the bottom of the stairs, once their eyes adjust, is the foreshore itself, and it is worth pausing on what that actually looked like, because the word foreshore undersells it considerably. At full low tide along this stretch of the Thames, the water can retreat well over 100 yards from the high water line, exposing an enormous flat expanse of mud, shingle and standing puddles that, an hour earlier, was entirely underwater and will be entirely underwater again in a matter of hours. It is not sand, it is not the firm, walkable beach a modern visitor to the coast might picture. It is mud in the fullest and least forgiving sense of the word, a dense, black, glutinous substance built up over centuries out of silt, sewage, industrial waste, and the accumulated debris of the largest city in the world, cold enough in April to numb bare feet within minutes and thick enough in its worst patches to hold a foot fast the way wet cement holds anything set down in it before it cures. Ada has walked this particular stretch of foreshore since she was 5 years old. She still, every single low tide, takes her first few steps onto it with the same deliberate, testing caution her mother taught her. Because the mud that held firm yesterday can shift overnight, and because the one lesson every mudlark learns early, or does not survive long enough to learn at all, is that the foreshore does not stay the same from one tide to the next. For the historians who have studied this population most closely in the years since, among them Lara Meiklem, who spent more than a decade working this same river as a modern mudlark before turning her research into a widely read account of the foreshore's long history, the sheer scale of the Victorian mudlark population says something important about the city that produced it. London in 1880 was, by most measures available to its own citizens, the wealthiest city that had ever existed. The administrative and financial centre of an empire that spanned roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface, and running directly through the middle of that wealth, twice a day, every day, was a population of children and old people wading barefoot into freezing mud for the chance of finding a few pennies worth of coal. The two facts sat beside each other in the same city, on the same river, without much apparent contradiction to the people living through it, because that was simply how London worked and had always worked, and showed very little sign in 1880 of being about to work any differently. There is something worth noticing before we go further into what the mud itself actually contained in the sheer ordinariness of Ada's morning to the people living it. Nobody in her family discussed whether she should go down to the foreshore this particular Tuesday. It was simply the thing that happened at low tide. The way the sun rising was simply the thing that happened at dawn. And the fact that it required a 9-year-old girl to walk barefoot into water contaminated by nearly 4 million people's worth of waste was not, to anyone in Ada's world, a fact that called for discussion. It called for a shawl and a tin box and the particular caution that keeps a person alive in mud that can turn from solid to treacherous within the space of a single step. Now, the mud itself, because until you understand what that surface actually was, nothing else about this trade makes sense, including why it killed people who had walked across it 1,000 times before without incident. If you picture dangerous mud at all, you probably picture something like quicksand in an adventure story. A clearly marked patch that swallows a person whole in a matter of seconds while onlookers scream and throw ropes. The real danger of the Thames foreshore worked nothing like that, and was, in its way, considerably more frightening for how quietly it operated. Certain stretches of the foreshore, particularly near old wharves, drainage outfalls, and the mouths of smaller tributary creeks feeding into the main river, developed patches of exceptionally soft, deep mud that experienced mudlarks called sinks. A local term that never made it into any official report, but that every person working this stretch of river understood perfectly well. A sink did not announce itself. It looked, to the eye, almost identical to the firm mud surrounding it, the same dark colour, the same faint sheen where the last of the tide water had drained away. The difference only became apparent the moment a foot pressed down into it, and by then the difference was already doing its work. A sink could pull a leg into the knee within a few seconds of missed footing. And the deeper a leg sank, the more the surrounding mud closed and thickened around it, creating a genuine suction that a person's own strength, especially a child's, was often not enough to brake unassisted. That alone would have been a serious problem in an ordinary body of standing water. On a tidal river, it was potentially a death sentence, because the mud does not exist on its own schedule. It exists on the river's schedule, and the river's schedule does not pause for anyone caught the wrong way in it. The Thames at London is a tidal river for a considerable distance inland, its water level rising and falling roughly twice in every 24 hours in a rhythm governed by the moon rather than the clock. And the difference between high and low water along this stretch could run to 20 feet or more. An enormous vertical distance to imagine, disappearing and reappearing twice a day if you have never lived beside a fully tidal river yourself. The retreat of that water at low tide is what exposes the foreshore mudlarks like Ada worked. Its return is what makes every hour spent on that mud a negotiation with a deadline that cannot be argued with, postponed, or for a child trapped to the knee in a sink 200 yards from the nearest stair, escaped by simply deciding to leave early. A mudlark working this stretch of the Thames had, depending on the particular tide and the particular day, somewhere in the range of 5 to 6 hours between the moment the water fully retreated and the moment it returned to cover the same ground again. And the return, unlike the retreat, did not happen gradually and forgivingly. The incoming tide on a river this size moves with real force and real speed, particularly in the final hour before it reclaims the lowest lying stretches of foreshore, and a person still working 200 yards out when that final hour arrived faced a walk back to solid ground across mud that was, by then, already beginning to flood in the lowest channels first. Cutting off the most direct paths back exactly when the remaining time to use them was shortest. Every experienced mudlark, Ada included, carried in her head a constantly updating map of exactly how far out she had walked, how long she had been out there, and how much of that walk back remained safe. A piece of continuous mental arithmetic that never fully switched off for the entire length of a working tide. Because the one calculation a mudlark could not afford to get wrong, even once, was the one involving how much time was left. For Ada, this particular Tuesday's low tide runs from roughly 3:30 until close to 9:30. A full working morning by the standards of her trade, and she and Sarah spend the first hour of it doing what every mudlark's morning begins with. Walking the stretch of foreshore nearest their own stairs while the light is still too poor to see any real distance. Testing the ground with each step the way a blind person tests a floor with a cane, feeling for the particular give underfoot that marks the difference between mud that will hold and mud that will not. Sarah has taught Ada to watch for a faint discoloration, a mud that looks very slightly wetter and darker than its surroundings, even when the difference is almost too subtle to name. And Ada has learned, over 4 years, to trust that instinct over her own eyes in the half-light of a spring dawn. She has never been caught in a sink past her ankle. She has watched another child, a boy she knew only by sight from a neighbouring court, pulled free by 2 grown men after being caught to the thigh with the tide already turning. An event that has stayed with her far more vividly than any lecture from her mother ever could have. Historians of the Thames, drawing on coroner's records and newspaper accounts from across the second half of the 19th century, have documented that drowning on the tidal foreshore was neither rare nor, to the authorities of the period, especially newsworthy, precisely because it happened often enough to stop being a novelty. A person caught by a sink, or simply misjudging the time remaining before the tide's return, faced a death that combined genuine physical restraint with the rising, unstoppable water of one of the busiest rivers in the world. A combination that left very little room for a rescue to arrive in time even when help was nearby and willing. The Thames watermen and the river's own informal community of workers, the lightermen, the dock labourers, the other mudlarks working nearby, were often the only rescue a person in trouble could realistically expect. And their success depended entirely on how quickly someone noticed how far away help happened to be standing, and how much of the tide's return window remained when the trouble started. There was no organised foreshore rescue service in 1880, no lifeguard watching from a post, no whistle to summon assistance. There was only whoever happened to be close enough to hear a child calling, and whether that was close enough in time. The broader context here matters, because the danger of the mud was not an unfortunate accident of geography that London simply had to live with. It was, in real measure, a consequence of decisions made upstream and downstream of the Mudlarks themselves. Decisions about how the river's banks were shaped, dredged, and built up over the preceding century. Decisions that had nothing to do with the people who would eventually be walking on the result. Wharf construction, dock excavation, and the steady narrowing of the river's usable channel through decades of embanking and reclaiming land along its edges all altered the pattern of silt deposit along the foreshore. And the particular treachery of certain stretches near Bermondsey and Rotherhithe, the stretches Ada and Sarah worked, was in some real sense an inherited hazard, a side effect of the same industrial and commercial development that had put the docks, and therefore the coal, and therefore the Mudlarks, in that exact location to begin with. There is a particular kind of attention that develops in a person who has spent years working ground that can, without warning, decide to hold them fast against a returning tide. And it is not the anxious, flinching attention of someone who is afraid. It is closer to the steady, practiced attention of a person who has simply made peace with a danger that cannot be removed and can only be managed, hour by hour, tide by tide, for as long as the body doing the managing holds out. Which brings us to the question of what, exactly, Ada and Sarah were standing in for 6 hours at a stretch, because the mud itself, apart from its capacity to trap a leg, carried a second danger that no amount of careful footwork could avoid. If you picture the Thames of 1880, fresh off the completion of Bazalgette's celebrated sewer network, you probably picture a river that had, more or less, solved its own sewage problem, a waterway restored to something approaching cleanliness by the greatest feat of civil engineering the century had produced. That picture is not wrong. Exactly, it is simply incomplete in a way that mattered enormously to anyone standing in the mud rather than admiring the water from a bridge. Bazalgette's intercepting sewers were designed to carry the great bulk of London's waste well past the city itself before releasing it into the tidal river at Barking and Crossness, far downstream of anywhere a fashionable Londoner was likely to be strolling. What that design could not fully prevent, and was never actually built to prevent, was the periodic overflow of the older combined sewer system during heavy rain, when stretches of pipe built decades earlier for rainwater alone, and since pressed into service carrying household waste as well, simply exceeded their capacity and discharged directly into the river at dozens of points along its length rather than carrying their contents all the way to the purpose-built outfalls downstream. On a dry week, the water Ada waded through carried a diluted, mostly settled residue of the city's waste, unpleasant but manageable by the standards her body had built up over years of exposure. After a hard rain, that same stretch of foreshore carried considerably more, and considerably fresher, and the mud held on to what the water left behind long after the water itself had receded. Sewage, though, was only one ingredient in what the mud along Ada's stretch of river actually contained, and arguably not the most dangerous one. Bermondsey and its neighbouring district of Rotherhithe, where Ada worked, sat at the centre of one of London's most concentrated industrial zones, a district whose tanneries, glue works, bone-boiling establishments, and gasworks had earned it, among Londoners who knew the area at all, a reputation for a smell distinctive enough to identify blindfolded. The tanning trade that dominated much of Bermondsey's riverside economy relied on lime pits to loosen hair and flesh from raw animal hides before the actual tanning process began, and on large quantities of tannic acid drawn traditionally from ground oak bark to cure the hides themselves, and the wastewater from both processes, heavily alkaline from the lime and thick with organic and chemical residue from the tanning liquors, drained with very little regulation directly toward the nearest available outlet, which was, more often than any tannery owner cared to advertise, the river itself. A short distance further along the same stretch, the gasworks that supplied fuel for London's street lamps and household lighting produced, as an unavoidable byproduct of converting coal into gas, large quantities of coal tar and what the trade called ammoniacal liquor, a foul, chemically active runoff laden with compounds that a modern chemist would recognize immediately as hazardous. Phenols, cyanide compounds, and a range of sulfur-based residues among them. Some gasworks operators sold their coal tar and ammoniacal liquor to other industries that had found uses for the byproducts. A significant amount, particularly from smaller or less well-managed works, simply drained or was tipped into the nearest waterway, because the alternative, proper containment and disposal, cost money that most gasworks in this period had no legal obligation to spend. What all of this meant, in practical terms, for a 9-year-old girl standing knee-deep in the exposed mud of the Bermondsey foreshore was that the substance closing over her bare feet and ankles for 6 hours at a stretch was never simply mud, and never simply river water. It was a slowly shifting cocktail of human waste, animal waste from the tanneries, industrial chemical residue from the gasworks, and whatever solid debris the tide had carried in and failed to carry back out again. All of it settling into the same dark, cold, glutinous surface that Ada and every other mudlark on this stretch of river had learned to read for its firmness and had never been taught. Because nobody in a position to teach it fully understood the danger themselves, to read for what it actually contained. Ada's own relationship with this reality was, by necessity, almost entirely physical rather than intellectual. She could not have named hydrogen sulfide or tannic acid or ammoniacal liquor, and neither, in any precise chemical sense, could most of the adults working alongside her. What she knew, in the way a body learns things a mind has never been given the vocabulary to explain, was that certain stretches of the foreshore smelt different from others, sharper, more chemical, closer to the tanneries and the gasworks than to open water, and that those stretches were also, more often than not, the stretches where a small cut on her foot or hand seemed to take longer to heal and hurt more in the meantime. She had learned, the way Sarah had taught her, to rinse any open scrape as quickly as she could manage with whatever clean water was available, usually precious little, and to keep half an eye on any wound for the following several days, watching for the particular reddened swelling that everyone on the foreshore had learned to take seriously, because everyone on the foreshore had, at one point or another, watched a minor injury turn into something considerably worse. Historians studying the environmental record of Victorian industrial London, including researchers who have worked through the surviving records of the Metropolitan Board of Works and the various sanitary inspectors employed by individual parishes, have found that the regulatory apparatus meant to control this kind of industrial discharge was, through most of the 1870s and 80s, a patchwork of local bylaws enforced with wildly inconsistent seriousness depending on which vestry happened to be responsible for a given stretch of riverbank, and how much political and economic weight the offending tannery or gasworks carried within that vestry's own affairs. A large, well-established works with deep local roots and a payroll that mattered to the surrounding community could often discharge waste for years past the point a smaller operation would have been fined or shut down, simply because the men enforcing sanitary law and the men running the works often belonged, in some meaningful sense, to the same local establishment, with every incentive to look past a problem that was, after all, only affecting the foreshore, and only affecting the people who worked it. There is something worth sitting with in the particular shape of this arrangement. The same river that Parliament had spent 20 years and a fortune in public money cleaning up for the benefit of the city's health, the same embankment built specifically to put granite and gaslight between polite London and the water it used to fear, still received every single day a fresh dose of exactly the kind of contamination the entire sanitary project had been built to eliminate, poured in not by the crumbling old cesspits Bazalgette's generation had worked so hard to abolish, but by the newer, more modern industries that had grown up along its banks in the meantime. The Mudlarks were not wading through a hazard London had simply failed to solve. They were wading through a hazard the city's own continuing industrial growth was actively producing, fresh, every single tide, in full view of anyone who cared to look, and almost nobody with the power to stop it did. The smell alone would tell an experienced Mudlark something was different about a given stretch of foreshore. What waited underfoot, invisible until the moment it was already too late, told a considerably harsher story. If you imagine the physical hazards of scavenging along a 19th century riverbank, you probably imagine something manageable, uncomfortable footing, perhaps. Cold water, the general unpleasantness of mud between the toes. What the foreshore actually held, scattered invisibly through every inch of that black surface, was an enormous accumulation of broken and discarded material sharp enough to open flesh to the bone, deposited there by more than a century of a city throwing away, dropping, and losing whatever it no longer wanted directly into the one place its poorest residents were forced to walk barefoot. Broken glass, from bottles, from windows, from the enormous volume of manufactured glassware a Victorian city produced and discarded continuously, settled into the mud in shards of every size, some large enough to see and avoid indecent light. Many worn down by the water into small, dull-edged fragments that looked, to an untrained eye, almost like ordinary stones, and cut just as deeply as the sharper pieces the moment a bare foot pressed down on one at the wrong angle. Rusted iron, in the form of old nails, broken chain links, discarded tools, and the countless small metal fittings that fell from boats, wharves, and cargo handling every single day presented a danger of its own kind, one that went considerably beyond the pain of the initial wound. Ada carries, on the outer edge of her right foot, the scar from exactly this kind of injury sustained the previous winter when a rusted nail, half buried in the mud and invisible in the low light of a December morning, drove nearly half an inch into her soul. The immediate pain was bad enough that she cried out, loud enough that Sarah heard her from 30 feet away and came at something close to a run across ground that punished running severely. What followed over the next several days was, in its way, more frightening than the injury itself. The wound reddened, then swelled, then began producing a discharge that Bridget Pell recognized from bitter experience with two of Ada's younger siblings as the early signs of a wound turning bad, and for nearly a week the entire household existed in a state of quiet, watchful dread, because everyone in that room understood, without needing the medical vocabulary to explain exactly why, that a wound like this one could, without warning, become the kind of injury a child did not recover from. The medical reality behind that dread was considerably starker than most of the families living it had the education to fully articulate, though the pattern itself was familiar to every household on the court. A puncture wound from a rusted nail, driven into flesh already exposed for hours at a stretch to water thick with organic and animal waste, created something close to an ideal environment for the kind of infection Victorian medicine understood only in its broadest outlines but recognized with grim practical certainty when it saw the results. Tetanus, caused by bacteria commonly present in soil, dust and animal waste, could enter the body through exactly this kind of deep puncture wound and, in the days that followed, produced the progressively worsening muscle rigidity and spasm that gave the disease its older popular name, lockjaw, a condition that killed a substantial share of the people it infected in this period, and that no Victorian physician possessed any reliable treatment for once symptoms had begun. Blood poisoning, what a modern physician would recognize as sepsis, followed a similarly grim pattern, a wound that reddened, swelled and grew hot to the touch, spreading its infection outward through the bloodstream in a process that, before the development of antibiotics more than half a century later, medicine could observe, describe with considerable clinical precision, and very rarely stop. Gangrene, the death and decay of tissue starved of healthy blood supply, represented the third face of the same underlying danger, and for a labouring family with no ability to afford sustained medical care, An infected limb that progressed to gangrene often meant a stark and terrible choice between amputation, performed under conditions considerably less sterile than the operating theatres of a proper hospital, and a slow systemic infection that eventually proved fatal. Ada's foot healed, in the end, without turning into any of these worse outcomes, though it took the better part of 3 weeks before she could walk on it without a pronounced limp. 3 weeks in which her contribution to the family's income from the foreshore dropped to almost nothing, and her mother's careful weekly arithmetic had to absorb a gap it had no real cushion to absorb. Sarah Coyle has not been so fortunate across her own decades on the river. She lost the smallest finger of her left hand 15 years ago to an infection that began as an unremarkable cut from a piece of broken crockery, and she carries, though she rarely mentions it, a persistent stiffness in one knee that she privately traces back to a deep cut sustained in her 30s that never fully healed the way an equivalent wound might have healed in a person with better food, warmer lodging, and the ability to rest a damaged limb rather than return to the mud at the next low tide, regardless of how the previous injury was healing. Medical writers and public health investigators of the period, working from hospital admission records and the casebooks of dispensary physicians serving districts like Bermondsey and Rotherhithe, documented a strikingly consistent pattern among the Mudlark population and other labourers whose work regularly exposed them to contaminated water and sharp debris. A pattern of chronic, recurring minor injuries that, left untreated by any qualified physician, at rates families like the Pells simply could not afford, accumulated over years into the kind of visible physical toll that marked out a Mudlark, a docker, or a tannery worker from a more sheltered Londoner at a glance. Missing fingers, persistent limps, the particular careful, testing gait of a person who has learned not to trust their own footing even on solid ground. None of this registered to the comfortable classes observing it from a distance as the accumulated cost of dangerous, unregulated labour. It registered, when it registered at all, simply as what the poor looked like, an appearance treated as an inherent characteristic of poverty rather than as the visible, physical bill for work that nobody with any better option would have chosen to do. There is a particular kind of vigilance that develops in a body that has learned, through repeated hard experience, exactly how quickly an ordinary small wound can become a serious danger. And it shows up in a child like Ada, not as fear exactly, but as a kind of automatic unconscious carefulness, a habit of checking her own feet and hands for fresh cuts the moment she steps off the mud each morning, the way another child might check a pocket for a lost coin. It was not paranoia. Given what the mud actually contained, it was simply an accurate reading of the odds. So why endure any of it? The sinks, the sewage, the broken glass, the rusted iron. The answer sits in a small tin box very much like Ada's own, and in the particular arithmetic of what 6 hours in that mud could actually buy a family by evening. If you picture the reward for this kind of labour, you might reasonably assume the Mudlarks were searching for treasure in some meaningful sense. Coins, jewellery, the occasional dramatic find that made the whole dangerous morning worthwhile. That happened, rarely enough that it barely factored into anyone's actual planning. The real economy of the foreshore ran on considerably humbler material, gathered in small quantities and sold for small sums, and understanding exactly what that material was and exactly what it was worth is the only way to understand why a family would send a 9-year-old daughter into contaminated water at all. Coal was the single most valuable and most consistently available find, dropped in small lumps from the shovels of the men loading and unloading the colliers that lined the wharves near Ada's stretch of river. Colliers that brought coal down from the northeast of England in quantities vast enough that a certain percentage, no matter how carefully the loading crews worked, always ended up in the water or on the mud below. A Mudlark with sharp eyes and a good stretch of foreshore near an active coal wharf could gather several pounds of usable coal in a single low tide. Coal that could either be burned in the family's own grate, a real and meaningful saving on a household's largest regular expense after food and rent, or sold directly to poorer neighbours who had no access to the foreshore themselves at a price well below what a coal merchant would charge. Old rope was the second staple of the trade, pulled from the mud in lengths ranging from a few feet to, occasionally, a useful coil. Rope that had fallen or been discarded from the barges and ships working the river, and that a mudlark could sell. Once picked apart into its individual fibres, as oakum, the loose fibrous material used throughout the shipbuilding trade to caulk the seams between a vessel's timbers. A use so constant and so essential to a maritime nation that oakum picking was also, not coincidentally, one of the standard forms of enforced labour inside the workhouses and prisons of the same period, a detail that gives the trade a particularly bitter symmetry when you consider that the free children on the foreshore and the confined inmates behind workhouse walls were, in a very real sense, competing to supply the exact same commodity to the exact same buyers. Beyond coal and rope, the foreshore yielded a steady, unglamorous trickle of scrap metal, copper nails and fittings especially prized for the relatively high price they fetched, along with iron of any usable size, and bones. Animal bones washed down from the slaughterhouses, knackers' yards, and kitchens of a city that consumed an enormous quantity of meat and discarded the remains with very little ceremony. Bones that a mudlark could sell on to be ground into fertilizer or processed for glue and other industrial uses. None of this material was worth much individually. A single copper nail might fetch a fraction of a penny. A modest haul of bones, gathered across an entire morning's careful searching, might add up to a penny or two once sold. It was only in aggregate, across a full 6-hour tide of continuous, careful, cold work, that the trade produced anything resembling a wage, and even then, the wage it produced was, by any standard, a desperately thin one. Henry Mayhew, in his own research among the mudlark population of the 1840s, calculated their average daily earnings at somewhere around 3p, a figure that historians working from later records suggest remained broadly consistent, adjusted only slightly for the passage of decades, through the 1880s as well. On an especially good day, a mudlark working a productive stretch of foreshore near an active wharf, and lucky enough to find something more valuable than the usual scattering of coal and rope, might bring home as much as 6p, twice the ordinary rate. To put those figures in terms that meant something to a family like the Pells, a loaf of bread in London at this period cost somewhere in the range of 4 to 5p, meaning a genuinely good day's mudlarking, 6p, might just cover a single loaf with a little left over, while an ordinary day's 3p would not stretch to bread alone without some other contribution to the household's income arriving from somewhere else. A night's bed in one of the cheapest common lodging houses serving districts like Bermondsey, the kind of establishment a family fell back on when rent itself became briefly unmanageable, could run to a penny or two for the very roughest accommodation, meaning that in the harshest calculation of all, a full morning of a child's labour in contaminated water undertaken at real risk to life and limb, might buy, on a bad day, roughly a single night's floor space and nothing else. Ada does not think of this arithmetic in the abstract terms a historian might use to describe it. She thinks of it, when she thinks of it at all, in the very concrete terms of what her tin box and her apron pockets contain at the end of a given morning, and what that particular haul is likely to be worth once Sarah, who has decades more experience judging the going rate, helps her assess it. This particular Tuesday yields, by the time the tide has turned and the two of them make their way back up the water stairs, a modest but respectable haul, several lumps of coal worth carrying home directly, a length of rope perhaps 4 feet long, 2 bent nails, and a single small bone that Ada nearly overlooked in the low light. Sold together to the rag and bone dealer who sets up his cart 3 mornings a week at the top of Jacob Street, it will likely fetch something close to 4p, a solidly ordinary result, neither the disaster of an empty morning nor the small triumph of a particularly good one. That dealer and the wider trade of rag and bone men who bought the Mudlark's finds across London. occupied a position in this economy that historians studying the period have described in consistently unflattering terms, and the description holds up well against the surviving evidence. A rag and bone dealer bought material from people who had, structurally, no other buyer available to them and no realistic ability to hold out for a better price, a market condition that gave the dealer enormous leverage to offer rates well below what the same material might fetch from a more distant, better capitalized purchaser. Sarah has told Ada more than once about dealers in other parts of London known to offer rates a full penny or two below what a more honest buyer would pay for the identical haul of coal or bone, counting correctly on the fact that a mudlark with a bag of wet, heavy material and a 6-hour walk between low tides had neither the time nor the transport to shop the goods elsewhere before they became, in the case of anything organic, considerably less sellable. The broader pattern here is one that shows up across nearly every corner of London's labouring poor in this period, a population that generated real, tangible economic value through hard and often dangerous labour, and then surrendered a substantial share of that value, almost by structural necessity, to the single intermediary standing between their labour and any usable form of money. Ada Pell's morning in the mud produced something the city actually needed and would otherwise have to pay considerably more to obtain by other means: recovered coal, recycled metal, raw material for the glue and fertilizer trades. What it produced for Ada herself, once the rag and bone man's cart had rolled on to the next court, was a few pence, weighed carefully into her mother's palm and folded immediately into the same relentless daily calculation of rent, coal, and bread that governed every other hour of the Pell family's existence. There is one category of discovery on the foreshore that Mayhew and the later writers who followed him discuss with a particular carefulness, and that deserves the same careful attention here, because it was, uncomfortable as it is to sit with, an ordinary feature of the trade rather than a rare and shocking exception to it. If you imagine what a child scavenging the Thames might occasionally find washed up among the coal and the rope, you probably do not immediately picture a human body, and understandably so. It is not the image most people carry of Victorian river life. But the Thames of 1880 was a working river running through the middle of a city of nearly 4 million people, crossed daily by thousands of boats of every size, lined with docks where accidents were common, and bordered by bridges from which a certain number of Londoners, driven by poverty, despair, or simple misadventure, fell or jumped every single year. The river that carried away London's waste also, with a grim regularity that its own residents had long since stopped finding remarkable, carried away a portion of its dead, and a share of those dead surfaced, eventually, on exactly the kind of foreshore where mudlarks like Ada spent their mornings. The discovery of a body was not, for an experienced mudlark, the singular, horrifying event a modern reader might assume it to be. Sarah Coyle has found 4 in her more than 4 decades on the river, by her own count, and speaks of each with a matter-of-fact particularity. This one a young man near Cherry Garden Stairs, clearly a dock accident by the state of him. That one an older woman whose family, once found, seemed almost relieved to have somewhere definite to grieve, rather than the open uncertainty of a person simply gone. Ada herself has not yet made such a discovery, though she has walked past the aftermath of one, a small cluster of watermen and a constable gathered around something on the mud a few hundred yards from her usual stretch, on a morning when she was perhaps 7 years old. And she remembers more than any specific detail of what she saw, the particular quiet, unhurried way the adults around her handled the whole business. None of the screaming or fainting a storybook might suggest, simply a sober, business-like attention to a task that needed doing. That practicality extended, in a detail that tells you something important about how thoroughly poverty could reorganize even a person's relationship with death, to money. The discovery and reporting of a body to the proper authorities, whether the river police or a local constable, was understood along the working stretches of the Thames to carry a small reward, a fee paid, depending on the arrangement, either by the coroner's office or informally by the family once located, to whoever had found and properly reported the remains. Charles Dickens, writing his novel Our Mutual Friend only a decade or so before the period this story is set in, built an entire opening chapter around a waterside scavenger named Gaffer Hexam, who works the Thames specifically for what the river's dead can bring him, and while Hexam is a fictional character, the trade Dickens describes around him. A documented, if uncomfortable, economy built around the recovery of drowned bodies was drawn directly from a practice every waterside Londoner of the period would have recognized without needing it explained. A mudlark who found a body did not, typically, simply leave it for someone else to discover. She reported it, because a reported body, grim as the transaction was worth more to a family in Ada's position than a body left for the tide to carry back out and deposit somewhere else entirely. The broader context behind this arrangement says something worth sitting with about how thoroughly Victorian London's poorest residents had learned to extract value from every corner of a world that offered them almost nothing freely. This was not, whatever a squeamish modern reader might initially assume, a sign of callousness or a diminished capacity for grief among the mudlark population. Sarah Coyle, by every account Ada has ever heard from her, treats the recovery of a body with real and evident respect, making sure, whenever she has found one, that the remains are handled with as much care and dignity as a person in her position can arrange, covering the body where she can, staying with it until help arrives, rather than simply reporting it and walking away. The reward she and others in her position accepted for that work reflected the plain economic reality of her life, not any failure of feeling, in exactly the same way that Ada's tin box of worthless treasures, kept for no financial reason at all, reflects the fact that a person forced to extract value from nearly everything around her can still, and does still, hold some things simply because she wants to. River-based social historians studying the Thames watermen and the broader community of people who worked its banks and its water for a living, including scholars who have examined the records of the Thames Division of the Metropolitan Police, the successor to the original Marine Police Force founded in the last years of the previous century specifically to combat the theft and disorder that had once plagued the river's cargo trade. Note that this same police force bore direct responsibility for a great deal of the formal process around recovered bodies, receiving reports, arranging for a coroner's inquest where one was warranted, and attempting, where any means of identification survived, to notify a family. The mudlarks and watermen who found the bodies in the first place occupied an informal but essential position in that entire system, functioning, whether anyone in an official capacity ever framed it this way, as the river's actual first responders, present on the water and along its banks in numbers and at hours no formal police patrol could match. For Ada, the possibility of such a discovery exists as one more item in the same running mental catalogue of the foreshore's hazards that includes the sinks, the glass, and the returning tide, acknowledged without being dwelt upon, because dwelling on any single danger of this trade for longer than necessary was, in a life that required 6 hours of sustained attention on this river nearly every single day, a luxury that served no useful purpose. She has been told what to do by both her mother and Sarah should she ever come across a body herself: to stay calm, to avoid disturbing anything unnecessarily, to call for the nearest adult she can find, and to remember, above all, that this too, unsettling as it was simply part of what the river occasionally required of the people who worked it. There is a particular kind of resilience in a community that has learned to fold even this into the ordinary rhythm of a working morning, not through any hardness of heart, but through the simple accumulated experience of having encountered it often enough that the shock had, of necessity, worn away, leaving behind something closer to a sombre, practiced competence. The Thames in 1880 gave London its coal, its rope, its scrap iron, and its river-borne trade. It also, on occasion, gave back what it had taken from the city in another form entirely, and the people who worked its banks had learned, because they had no real alternative, to receive that too with the same steady hands they brought to everything else the mud offered them. The river did not sort its dangers neatly into water and mud and rusted iron. Some of the sharpest competition Ada faced on a given morning came from other people, and understanding why requires understanding just how unevenly the foreshore's opportunities were actually distributed. If you picture a stretch of open riverbank at low tide, you might imagine it as more or less interchangeable ground. 100 yards of mud offering roughly the same chance of a find as the next 100 yards over. The Mudlarks themselves knew better and organized their entire working lives around the knowledge. Certain stretches of foreshore, particularly the ground directly below an active coal wharf or a busy stretch of barge traffic, produced a steady, reliable trickle of dropped coal and cargo that made them enormously more valuable than an equivalent stretch of empty riverbank further from any working dock. A mudlark with regular, unchallenged access to good ground near a coal wharf could reasonably expect to out-earn a mudlark confined to poorer ground by a considerable margin. A difference that, given how thin the trade's margins already ran, was the difference between a family managing and a family going without. This scarcity produced exactly the kind of territorial pressure it would produce in any economy where good ground was limited and desperate people needed it. Groups of mudlarks, particularly the older and more established children who had worked a given stretch for years, developed something close to informal claims over the best patches of foreshore. Claims enforced not through any legal or official mechanism, but through simple physical presence, group loyalty, and, when it came to it, outright confrontation with anyone attempting to work ground that a rival group considered theirs. Sarah has told Ada about fights on the foreshore going back decades, shoving matches and worse between rival groups of children contesting a particularly promising stretch near a coal barge that had just finished unloading. Disputes that could turn seriously violent when the stakes, a morning's entire earnings for an already desperate family, felt high enough to justify the risk. A newer or younger mudlark, working a stretch of river for the first time, learned quickly, often through direct and unpleasant experience, which ground belonged to which established group, and adjusted her own movements accordingly rather than risk a confrontation she was unlikely to win. Ada herself has occupied a fortunate position in this particular hierarchy, in large part because of her association with Sarah, whose decades on this stretch of the Thames have earned her a settled, largely unchallenged claim to a reasonably productive length of foreshore near the water stairs both of them use. A child working alongside Sarah inherits, in effect, a portion of that same standing, spared the worst of the territorial pressure that a truly friendless newcomer might face. It is one of the quieter reasons Ada's mother was so eager 4 years ago to place her daughter under Sarah's particular wing rather than simply sending her out onto the foreshore alone. Because the difference between working under an established mudlark's protection and working entirely without it could mean, in real terms, the difference between a productive stretch of ground and whatever poorer scraps a friendless child could claim without contest. The broader social position of the mudlarks within London's own hierarchy of poverty adds a second layer to this picture, one that extended well beyond the foreshore itself and shaped how the wider city understood, or more often simply failed to understand, who these people actually were. Mayhew's own account, and the accounts of the social investigators and journalists who followed him across the following decades, describe a population viewed by more comfortable Londoners with a mixture of pity and open suspicion, the mudlarks lumped together, in the popular imagination of the period. With the broader category of London's so-called dangerous classes, a phrase used freely in newspapers and parliamentary reports alike to describe the capital's poorest residents as a source of moral contamination and petty criminality rather than as people responding with real ingenuity to circumstances that had left them almost no other options. A mudlark caught taking material directly from a barge or a wharf rather than waiting for it to wash up naturally on the foreshore. A temptation that grew sharper on a morning when the legitimate fines ran thin, could be prosecuted for theft, and newspaper coverage of such prosecutions tended, consistently, to frame the case in terms of criminality rather than desperation. a framing that told readers considerably more about the assumptions of the comfortable classes writing the coverage than about the actual lives of the children standing in the dock. Mayhew himself represents something of an exception to this pattern, and it is worth pausing on why his account has survived so much more usefully than the newspaper coverage of his contemporaries, where other writers of the period tended to describe London's poor from a considerable moral and physical distance, offering judgment dressed up as observation. Mayhew actually walked the foreshore, sat with the people he was writing about, and recorded their own words and their own accounts of their own lives with a level of direct, patient attention that few social investigators of his era matched. His interviews preserve details that would otherwise have vanished entirely from the historical record, among them the account of a young Mudlark, a child of about Ada's own age, who drove a copper nail into her foot badly enough to be lamed for 3 full months, and whose mother, with no other means of getting her daughter to medical care, carried the child on her own back to the doctor every single morning for the length of that recovery. It is exactly the kind of detail no official report or newspaper column of the period thought worth preserving, and exactly the kind of detail that tells you, more directly than any statistic could, what this trade actually cost the people living it. There is a particular unfairness worth naming plainly in how this population was regarded by the society whose wealth their labour quietly helped sustain. The Mudlarks recovered coal that heated other people's homes, scrap metal that fed other people's factories, and bones that fertilized other people's fields, performing a genuine and continuous service to a city that depended, more than it ever acknowledged, on precisely this kind of unglamorous, unregulated recycling of its own waste. In exchange, that same city offered them, at best, indifference, and at worst, the casual assumption that a child standing in the mud with a sack of scavenged coal was more likely a petty thief than a desperate labourer doing exactly what her circumstances required of her. Ada has absorbed this assumption second-hand, in the way a well-dressed passer-by occasionally looks at her and Sarah with a flicker of open distaste as they carry their morning's haul up from the water stairs, a look she has learned, at 9 years old, to simply not meet. Because meeting it changes nothing about the coal in her sack or the rent due at the end of the week. What the territorial disputes and the social suspicion both reveal, underneath their very different surfaces, is the same underlying truth about this trade. The foreshore offered a genuine living, thin as it was, to the people desperate enough to claim it, and claiming it required fighting, in one form or another, on more fronts than the tide and the mud alone. Ada fought the cold every morning. She fought the risk of injury with every step. And she fought, in her own quiet way, simply by continuing the work at all, a wider city's casual assumption that people in her position deserved neither its sympathy nor its serious attention. Close your eyes for a moment and consider what 6 hours actually means for a body, standing in near freezing water on an April morning with no boots, no gloves, and a shawl too thin for the wind coming off the water. If you imagine the discomfort of cold feet on a winter morning, the kind that resolves itself the moment you step back indoors to a fire, you have some sense of where a Mudlark's morning began, and almost no sense of where it ended. The Thames in the colder months ran, by any reasonable estimate, only a handful of degrees above freezing, and a body standing in that water for the better part of a working tide experienced a form of cold exposure considerably more dangerous than the ordinary discomfort of a chilly day. A slow, cumulative loss of core body heat that the medical writers of the period, and the physicians who staffed the dispensaries serving districts like Bermondsey, recognized and treated regularly, even without the precise clinical vocabulary a modern doctor would use to describe it. Hypothermia, in a child working the foreshore through a London winter, rarely arrived as a single dramatic collapse. It arrived gradually, across a working morning, as a mounting exhaustion and a loss of feeling in the extremities that made the increasingly delicate work of the trade. Feeling for coal or a bent nail through several inches of freezing mud, progressively harder to perform with any precision right at the point in the morning when precision mattered most. Ada has known this exhaustion intimately since her first winter on the foreshore, the particular ache that sets into her hands and feet somewhere around the second hour of a cold tide, followed by a strange, deceptive numbness that Sarah has taught her, insistently and more than once, never to mistake for comfort. A child whose feet have simply stopped hurting has not solved the cold. She has lost the ability to feel the ground well enough to test it safely, which is its own separate and considerable danger on ground, where a missed step can mean a sink closing around an ankle before she even registers the change underfoot. The winter months brought a second, closely related danger that the historical record documents with grim consistency: a sharp rise in respiratory illness among the population working the foreshore regularly. A pattern hardly surprising given the combination of prolonged cold exposure, chronically damp clothing that rarely had the chance to fully dry between one working tide and the next, and lungs already burdened, in a district like Bermondsey, by the smoke of thousands of coal fires and the particular acrid air produced by the neighbouring tanneries and gasworks. Ada's own persistent winter cough, the one her mother has largely stopped worrying over because every child on the court carries some version of the same complaint, sits at the milder end of a spectrum that, for less fortunate children, extended through bronchitis, pneumonia, and the kind of chronic lung damage that dispensary physicians of the period documented repeatedly among labouring families. In riverside districts, without, in most cases, any real treatment beyond rest and warmth that a family like the Pells could rarely afford to provide in the quantities actually needed. Sarah Coyle, at somewhere past 60, embodies the cumulative version of exactly this pattern. Decades of cold mornings compressed into a body that moves. These days, with a visible stiffness in the joints and a wheeze in her breathing that grows noticeably worse by the end of a long winter tide. She does not describe herself as unwell. Exactly, because unwell implies a departure from some prior healthier baseline that a life spent on this particular river never really afforded her the chance to establish. She describes herself, when she describes herself at all, simply as an old woman doing what an old woman on this stretch of the Thames has always done. And the fact that her joints and her lungs carry the accumulated cost of 40 years of exactly the exposure Ada is only beginning to accumulate herself is not, to Sarah, a tragedy worth dwelling on so much as an ordinary fact of a life lived this particular way. Public health investigators working in London's poorer riverside parishes through the 1870s and 80s, drawing on dispensary and workhouse infirmary records, documented life expectancy figures for labouring populations in districts like Bermondsey that sat markedly below the figures recorded in the city's wealthier western parishes. A gap driven by exactly this combination of factors: chronic cold exposure, contaminated water, poor nutrition, overcrowded and poorly ventilated housing, and a near total absence of the kind of preventive medical care that might have caught a developing illness before it became a lasting one. A Mudlark's particular version of this broader pattern added its own specific weight to an already heavy burden. The direct, sustained, twice-daily exposure to cold water and contaminated mud that no other trade in the district. Not even the dock labourers and tannery workers, whose own conditions were harsh enough by any reasonable standard, quite matched in its combination of physical exposure and sheer duration. What strikes a modern reader most forcefully about this particular danger, more perhaps than the sharper, more dramatic hazards of drowning or infected wounds, is its sheer invisibility to the society surrounding it. A body slowly worn down over years by repeated cold exposure did not produce a single reportable incident, a newspaper item, a coroner's inquest. It produced, instead, a persistent cough that never quite cleared, a joint stiffness that arrived a decade or two earlier than it should have, a general and cumulative fragility that the comfortable classes of Victorian London, when they noticed it at all, simply filed under the same broad and dismissive heading they filed most of the poor's visible suffering. An unfortunate but essentially unremarkable feature of that particular class of person, rather than the direct, traceable consequence of 6 hours in freezing water twice a day, for years on end. There is a particular quiet courage in the way both Ada and Sarah have made peace with this reality, not through resignation exactly, but through the same practical, unsentimental attention they bring to every other hazard of their trade. The cold could not be avoided, only managed, layer by inadequate layer, tide by tide, for as long as each of their bodies continued to hold out against it. The cold was a danger Ada could feel arriving. The one we turn to now was considerably more dangerous precisely because she could not feel it at all until it had already taken hold. If you picture the great sanitary triumph of Bazalgette's sewers, you probably picture cholera as a solved problem by 1880, a 19th century horror finally and permanently banished from London by clean water and modern engineering, and in the broadest sense that picture is accurate. The city's last major cholera epidemic had struck in 1866, and the disease, once a recurring nightmare capable of killing thousands of Londoners within a matter of weeks, had grown steadily rarer as Bazalgette's system separated the city's drinking water more thoroughly from its waste. What that same broad picture leaves out, and what mattered enormously to a child standing daily in contaminated river mud, is that cholera was never the only waterborne threat London's poor lived with, and that the specific bacteria responsible for it, along with several of its close relatives, persisted in exactly the kind of warm, organically rich mud that lined the Bermondsey foreshore, in concentrations that a periodic epidemic never fully captured in the official statistics. Typhoid fever, caused by a different but related bacterium spread through water and food contaminated by human waste, remained thoroughly endemic across London through the entire period this story is set in, never producing the dramatic citywide panic of a cholera outbreak, but killing a steady, largely unremarked stream of Londoners every single year, concentrated overwhelmingly among the poorest districts with the least reliable access to clean water. A mudlark working 6 hours a day in mud that carried on a regular basis a fresh dose of exactly the kind of contamination typhoid required to spread, faced a level of ongoing exposure that a family in a wealthier, better drained part of the city simply never encountered in their daily lives. The mechanism of infection did not require a dramatic accident or a memorable moment of contact. It required only the ordinary, repeated business of the trade itself, hands moving through contaminated mud and then, inevitably, touching a mouth, a scraped knuckle, a piece of bread eaten without any real opportunity to wash first. Because clean water for washing was, in a household like the Pells, a resource too precious to spend freely on anything but the most essential uses. Ada's mother has lost a sister to exactly this kind of fever a decade earlier, a loss Bridget rarely discusses in any detail but that has left her with a watchfulness around her children's health that borders, at times, on something closer to dread, a fear she manages the same way she manages every other danger in her family's life, through careful, unglamorous measures rather than any outward display of the fear itself. She insists, more forcefully than she insists on almost anything else, that Ada and her siblings wash their hands and faces as thoroughly as the household's limited water allows before eating anything. A habit that offered real, if incomplete, protection against exactly the danger that had taken her sister, even though Bridget herself could not have named the bacterial mechanism involved and would have described her own insistence, if asked, simply as common sense passed down from her own mother rather than anything approaching medical theory. The broader medical understanding of the period sat in an uncomfortable and consequential transitional state through these very years. The germ theory of disease, associated most closely with researchers like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch working on the European continent, and increasingly accepted by Britain's more forward-thinking physicians by 1880, had not yet fully displaced an older explanatory framework, still held by a considerable number of practicing doctors and public health officials, that attributed disease outbreaks primarily to miasma, the theory that bad air itself, rather than specific living organisms transmitted through contaminated water, carried the primary responsibility for spreading illness through a crowded city. This transitional confusion had real consequences for how seriously London's authorities treated the specific danger of contaminated river mud as opposed to the more general and already well-addressed danger of bad-smelling air. A sanitary inspector convinced primarily of miasma theory might focus considerable attention on foul smells and poor ventilation while paying comparatively little direct attention to the specific bacterial content of the mud itself. A gap in official concern that left the actual waterborne danger facing the mudlarks considerably less studied and considerably less regulated than a fuller scientific understanding might otherwise have produced. What protection existed for a family like the Pells came not from any official quarter, but from exactly the kind of accumulated, unofficial folk knowledge that Bridget's hand-washing insistence represents. A body of hard-earned wisdom built up across generations of riverside families who had noticed, empirically, which habits seemed to correlate with fewer bouts of serious illness, even without any formal scientific framework to explain why. Sarah has her own version of this same inherited caution, a habit of never eating anything at all while still out on the foreshore, no matter how hungry the long morning has made her, saving even a small piece of bread carried from home until she has climbed back up the water stairs and had at least some opportunity to rinse her hands properly first. It is a small discipline, maintained across decades, and it reflects a level of instinctive understanding about disease that the university-trained miasma theorists of the period, for all their formal education, did not always manage to match. Ada herself has been ill with a fever serious enough to frighten her mother only once, at age 6, a bout that kept her from the foreshore for nearly 2 weeks, and that Bridget, in hindsight, has always privately suspected came from the river itself, though there was never any way to confirm the source with certainty. She recovered fully, a fact the family has always regarded with a quiet, unspoken gratitude, aware without ever quite saying so aloud that a different child, or the same child on a different occasion, might easily not have recovered at all. The dispensary records surviving from districts like Bermondsey through this period bear out exactly this kind of uncertainty as the ordinary experience of a labouring family, illness arriving without clear warning, departing without clear explanation, and the underlying cause. More often than the period's medicine could reliably determine, sitting quietly in the very mud that fed the family in the first place. There is something worth naming plainly in the shape of this particular danger, more than any other the foreshore presented. The sinks could be tested for. The glass could, with enough care, be mostly avoided. The cold could at least be felt arriving, in time to hurry back toward the stairs. The bacteria settled into that same mud offered no such warning at all, working invisibly, on a timeline measured in days rather than seconds, indifferent entirely to how carefully a child had learned to read every other hazard the river presented her. There is one more danger worth naming before we step back from Ada's particular morning, and it is not a danger of mud or water or glass at all. It is the danger, for a trade this precarious, of simply running out of river to work. If you imagine the Thames foreshore as a fixed and permanent feature of London, exposed mud that would always be there for anyone willing to brave it, you would be imagining something that was, in fact, already changing under the Mudlark's bare feet in 1880, and would change decisively within the working lifetime of a child Ada's age. The same civic ambition that had built the Victoria embankment along the fashionable stretches of the river in the 1860s and 70s, burying Bazalgette's low-level intercepting sewer under granite and gaslight while giving the city a handsome new riverside promenade, was, through the final 2 decades of the century, gradually extending that same treatment further along both banks of the Thames, replacing open, exposed mud with paved, embanked and increasingly inaccessible riverfront in one district after another. The logic behind this expansion, from the perspective of the Metropolitan Board of Works and its successor bodies, had very little to do with the Mudlarks at all, and that is, in its own way, the whole point. Embanking a stretch of riverbank served several purposes that mattered enormously to London's planners, improving the flow and navigability of the river itself, creating new land that could be sold or leased for valuable commercial development, and, not incidentally, burying yet more of the city's infrastructure, drains, gas mains. Eventually, the tunnels of the developing underground railway under a controlled and engineered surface, rather than leaving it exposed to the unpredictable business of a fully tidal river. Nobody sitting on the relevant committees was weighing the embankment's effect on London's Mudlark population in any serious way, because the Mudlarks, as we have already seen, occupied roughly the same place in the official civic imagination as the exposed mud itself, a feature of the old, disorderly Thames that a modern, well-managed river simply should not have, rather than a population of working people whose livelihood depended directly on that mud remaining exposed and accessible. Bermondsey and Rotherhithe, further from the fashionable central stretches the embankment had prioritised first, retained open, workable foreshore considerably longer than districts like Westminster and the City had, which is precisely why Ada's own stretch of river, in 1880, remains a viable place for a child to earn a few pence at low tide. That reprieve, though, was a matter of timing and geography rather than any lasting exemption. The same forces that had already paved over the mud in front of Parliament and the grand hotels of the Strand were extending steadily downriver through the final 2 decades of the century, driven by continued dock expansion, continued commercial development along the working stretches of the river, and a steadily hardening civic assumption shared by planners and reformers of very different political persuasions that an embanked, regulated riverfront was simply what a modern city was supposed to have, whatever it cost the people who had depended on the unregulated version. By the final years of the 1890s, when Ada, in the ordinary course of things, would be approaching 20, considerably more of London's working foreshore had been claimed by exactly this kind of embankment and dock expansion than existed in the spring of 1880, and the population of mudlarks working the river had contracted accordingly, not through any single dramatic policy or announcement, but through the slow, cumulative loss of the actual physical mud that the trade required to exist at all. A trade that had employed, by Mayhew's own count decades earlier, somewhere close to 1,000 people across the city's tidal foreshore, had, by the century's final years, shrunk to a fraction of that figure. And the families who had once relied on a child's morning haul of coal and rope to cover the gap between wages and rent were left, as the exposed ground itself simply disappeared, to find some other way of filling that same gap. A way the historical record, having lost interest in mudlarks the moment they grew scarce enough to stop being a subject worth investigating, does not preserve in any great detail. Historians who have traced this decline, Lara Meiklem prominent among them, note a particular and rather bitter irony in how it unfolded. The very engineering triumphs that made Victorian London cleaner, healthier, and more orderly for its comfortable residents, the sewers, the embankments, the expanding docks, were the same engineering triumphs that steadily eliminated the livelihood of the city's poorest and most vulnerable scavengers, without any of the planners responsible ever framing their work in those terms, and without any real mechanism by which the mudlarks themselves might have registered an objection that anyone in a position of authority would have felt obligated to hear. Progress in this particular corner of London's history did not arrive as a single clear improvement for everyone it touched. It arrived, as it so often did across the city's long 19th century, as a real benefit for some and a quiet, largely unrecorded loss for others, with very little overlap between who received which. Ada, on this particular Tuesday morning in April of 1880, has no way of knowing any of this, no sense that the stretch of foreshore her bare feet are standing on is, in the span of her own coming adulthood, going to shrink and eventually vanish under paving stones and dock walls she cannot yet imagine. She knows only that the tide is turning, that Sarah is already making for the water stairs with the particular unhurried but purposeful walk that means the safe window is narrowing, and that her own morning's haul, modest but respectable, needs to make the walk home with her rather than the walk back out to see the returning water is about to demand of everything left behind on the mud. There is something quietly poignant in the gap between what Ada actually knows on this particular morning and what the historical record now allows us to know about the years still ahead of her. A gap that exists in some form for nearly everyone the past ever produced, but that lands with particular weight here, in a trade whose entire world, mud and tide and coal barge alike, was already being dismantled around a 9-year-old girl who had no reason yet to suspect it. Step back now from this single Tuesday and consider the shape of an entire week, because no two low tides on this river ever actually delivered quite the same morning, and the variation itself was its own kind of ongoing hardship. If you imagine a week of mudlarking as this same routine simply repeated 7 times over, the same walk down the water stairs, the same careful testing of the mud, the same modest handful of coal and rope carried home each evening, you would be picturing something considerably steadier and more predictable than the trade actually allowed. The tide itself shifted its schedule by roughly 3/4 of an hour with each passing day, so that a low tide falling conveniently at 3:30 one morning might fall by the following week in the middle of the afternoon instead, forcing a family like the Pells to constantly reorganize their entire daily rhythm, meals, sleep, and any other work available to them. Around a clock that never held still for more than a few days running. A week that began with 2 comfortable early morning tides, worked before the rest of the household had fully woken, could end with a pair of tides falling deep in the night, requiring Ada to leave a warm bed at an hour when even Bermondsey's rougher streets carried their own separate dangers for a child walking alone toward the river. Weather compounded this unpredictability in ways that had nothing to do with the calendar and everything to do with what a given morning actually made possible. A hard rain overnight meant not only a colder, more miserable walk down to the foreshore, but a river running higher and faster than usual, carrying a fresh and considerably more concentrated dose of sewage overflow and industrial runoff down from the districts upstream, exactly the conditions Ada and Sarah had learnt to treat with particular caution. A period of strong wind off the water could make an already treacherous stretch of foreshore even harder to read, kicking up enough surface disturbance to disguise the subtle discoloration that marked a dangerous sink from the firmer mud around it. And a truly severe storm, rare but not unheard of even in an ordinary London spring, could keep a family off the foreshore entirely for a full tide or more. A decision that protected the children's safety and produced, in its place, an entirely predictable gap in the week's earnings that had to be absorbed somewhere else in the household's already thin budget. Ada's own week, in the ordinary run of things, followed a loose pattern shaped as much by her family's other obligations as by the tide itself. 2 or 3 mornings usually found her on the foreshore with Sarah, working whichever low tide the week's schedule happened to offer at a manageable hour. On days when the tide fell too late or too early to combine sensibly with the rest of the household's needs, her mother sometimes kept her home instead, minding her younger siblings while Bridget took in a neighbour's washing or ran whatever small errand the week required. A substitution that cost the family a morning's mudlarking income, but that no household with children under 10 could realistically avoid altogether. Saturdays carried their own particular rhythm, market day along Jacob Street, when the rag and bone dealer's cart drew a longer line than usual and the week's accumulated finds, kept dry and sorted as best the family's limited storage allowed, were finally converted into the coins that would see the Pells through to Monday. Sunday, by long custom rather than any formal rule, was the one day the foreshore mostly emptied of working mudlarks, regardless of what the tide itself was doing. A day of chapel for families inclined toward it and simple rest for those who were not, though Sarah has told Ada more than once about winters harsh enough and rent arrears large enough that even Sunday's informal truce broke down for families with no better option. The broader pattern this reveals, beyond the particular texture of Ada's own week, is how thoroughly this trade resisted the kind of steady, predictable planning that even London's other labouring poor could sometimes manage. A dock labourer's wage, however meagre, arrived on a fixed schedule and could be budgeted against with some confidence once a family understood the rhythm of it. A mudlark's income shifted with the moon, the weather, and the raw physical luck of what a given tide happened to expose. A variability that made the trade, for all its meager and unglamorous nature, considerably harder to plan a household's survival around than its critics. Comfortable enough themselves never to have had to try. Generally understood. There is a particular resilience required simply to hold a household together against income this unpredictable. And it fell. In the Pell family, as in most families of this kind, most heavily on Bridget, whose own daily arithmetic had to absorb not just the ordinary thinness of what Ada and Tom between them brought home, but the genuine uncertainty of not knowing, from one week to the next, which mornings would even be available for the trying. She managed it the way women in her position managed everything else, without complaint that anyone outside her own four walls ever heard, and with a quiet, exhausting vigilance that never fully switched off, because a family with no savings and no safety net could not afford, even for a single week, to stop paying attention to exactly how thin the margin between managing and not managing had actually become. The foreshore presented a particular challenge that had nothing to do with youth at all, and turning now to Sarah Coyle's own story rounds out a picture this account has so far told, mostly through a child's eyes. If you picture old age among London's Victorian poor, you probably picture something closer to quiet retirement. A life of reduced labour supported, modestly if at all, by grown children or whatever small savings a working life had allowed a person to set aside. For a woman in Sarah's position, that picture bore almost no relationship to reality. She had married young, to a lighterman named Michael Coyle, who spent 30 years moving cargo along this same stretch of the Thames before a fall from a barge in his 58th year left him with injuries he never fully recovered from, and that ended, within 2 winters, his life along with them. The couple had raised 4 children together, of whom 2 survived to adulthood, a son who had gone to sea and had not written home in nearly a decade, and a daughter who had married a labourer in Deptford and had, by Sarah's own account, troubles enough of her own household to manage without absorbing her widowed mother into it as well. What remained to Sarah, once her husband's small savings had been exhausted paying for his final illness and burial, was exactly what remained to most women in her position at the end of a working life spent married to a labouring man, very little formal income, no pension of any kind, and a body that, worn as it was by decades of hard living, was still required to produce its own subsistence for as many years as remained to it. The foreshore, for Sarah as for a considerable share of London's elderly poor, functioned as one of the very few forms of paid work still open to a woman past 60 with no capital, no trade skill that remained in demand, and no family able or willing to support her. It required no formal training beyond what could be picked up through observation and practice. No capital investment beyond a willingness to walk into cold water, and no employer's good favour to secure. Only the raw physical stamina to manage 6 hours on treacherous ground and the accumulated knowledge, built over years, of exactly where that ground was most likely to reward the effort. Mayhew's own research from decades earlier had already identified this same pattern. Elderly men and women turning to the foreshore precisely because every other door available to a younger worker had closed to them specifically on account of their age. And the pattern he documented in the 1840s had, by 1880, shown little sign of changing in any fundamental way. What this meant, in practice, was that the Thames foreshore hosted, on any given low tide, 2 populations at opposite ends of a human life working the identical dangerous ground for identical meagre reward. Children not yet old enough for more demanding trades, and the elderly no longer strong enough to hold on to the ones they had once had. The working-age adults who filled the years between, the dockers, the tannery hands, the casual labourers like Tom Pell, largely avoided the foreshore themselves, except in genuine desperation. Because a body capable of heavier, better-paid work generally found it, leaving the mud to exactly the 2 groups a society organised around physical labour had the least further use for. Sarah's own physical toll, laid out across 4 decades rather than the handful of years Ada has so far accumulated, offers a kind of preview of exactly where this trade leads a body that survives it long enough to grow old within it. The missing finger, the stiff knee, the wheeze that worsens through every winter and only partially eases each summer, and underneath all of that, a form of accumulated exhaustion that has less to do with any single injury or illness than with the sheer compounded weight of thousands of individual mornings spent in cold water. Each one manageable on its own. Each one leaving behind some small residue the body never quite recovered before the next low tide arrived to demand the same effort all over again. She does not describe this accumulation as suffering in the conversations Ada has had with her across 4 years of shared mornings on the mud. She describes it, when she describes it at all, in the same matter-of-fact, unsentimental register she brings to everything else about her life, an accounting of what the years have cost her rather than a complaint about the cost itself. It is Sarah, more than either of Ada's own parents, who has taught the girl the deeper craft of this trade, not simply where to place her feet, but how to read the specific color and texture of a promising stretch of mud, how to judge from the particular smell of the air whether the tide was likely to carry anything worth finding that morning, how to recognize from the pattern of activity along a distant wharf when a coal barge was likely to be unloading and dropping its usual scattering of fuel onto the mud below. This knowledge, accumulated across a lifetime and passed on almost entirely through direct observation and quiet correction rather than any formal instruction, represents a real and considerable expertise, the kind any trade guild of the period would have recognized and respected had it belonged to a more reputable profession. Nobody in Victorian London's official institutions ever thought to certify or honour it. It existed and was transmitted entirely within the informal community of the foreshore itself, from an old woman with nothing else left to teach to a young girl who would, in her turn, teach it to whoever came after her, if the foreshore itself lasted long enough to need teaching. There is something worth sitting with in the particular shape of the bond between Ada and Sarah, a relationship built entirely out of shared hardship and yet carrying, within that hardship, a real and evident tenderness. Sarah has no living daughter close enough to help her through the physical decline her own body is visibly entering. Ada has, in her own mother, a woman consumed nearly entirely by the demands of 4 children and an uncertain household income, with little spare attention left over for the particular kind of patient instruction Sarah has always seemed to have time for. Between the two of them, on the cold mud of a Bermondsey low tide, something has grown that resembles, more than anything else available to name it, a genuine and mutual adoption, an old woman and a young girl each filling, however imperfectly, a gap the rest of their circumstances had left open in the other's life. There is one last thread worth following before we step back from the mud entirely, and it concerns the objects themselves, the coal and the bone and the copper nail, and what eventually happened to the ones nobody ever sold. If you picture the small treasures a child like Ada kept apart from the material she sold, a bead, half a clay pipe, a button she liked the look of, you might assume they represent nothing more than a private sentimental footnote to an otherwise grim economic story. Consider, instead, what those same categories of object have since become. The clay pipe stems, the buttons, the coins and buckles and fragments of pottery that generations of London's poorest residents handled daily without a second thought, discarded by the thousand into a river that never stopped receiving whatever the city no longer wanted, now sit, cleaned and catalogued. In the collections of the Museum of London and in the private collections of the very hobbyists who have inherited the word Mudlark and stripped it almost entirely of the desperation it once carried. Lara Meiklum's own considerable public following, built across more than a decade of walking this same foreshore under a modern license from the Port of London Authority, has introduced hundreds of thousands of people to a version of this river's mud recast as a source of wonder rather than survival. a shift in meaning that says a great deal about which parts of history a comfortable society finds easy to romanticize once the actual danger and desperation have been sufficiently distanced by time. This is not a criticism of modern mudlarking, which by every reasonable account is practiced today with real care, genuine historical curiosity, and none of the coercion that sent a 9-year-old girl into contaminated water because her family could not otherwise afford bread. It is, instead, an observation about how thoroughly the passage of a century and a half can polish even the most uncomfortable history into something safe enough to enjoy as a pastime. The same transformation, in miniature, that turned the small dark commas of paint at the bottom of a Bond Street nocturne into a detail worth admiring for its atmosphere, rather than a detail worth asking any hard questions about. Henry Mayhew himself, whose patient, unglamorous documentary work across the 1840s preserved nearly everything we can now say with any confidence about who these people actually were, occupies an unusual and important position in this larger story. He was not, by most accounts, a natural crusader or reformer in the mould of some of his contemporaries. He was, first and most consistently, a careful listener, willing to sit on cold ground with people society had trained itself not to look at directly, and to write down what they told him about their own lives with a fidelity that few investigators of his era matched. That fidelity is the reason a modern account like this one can speak with any real confidence about the specific texture of a mudlark's morning, the copper nail through a child's foot, the 3p average daily wage, the 800 to 1,000 people working this trade across the whole of London rather than relying on the vague, moralizing generalizations that filled most other Victorian commentary on the capital's poor. Historians since, Lee Jackson and Judith Flanders among them, working through the surviving archival record of London's sanitary and social history, have built on exactly this foundation, confirming and extending Mayhew's original observations with parish records, coroner's reports, and the physical evidence the river itself continues, even now, to surrender back to anyone patient enough to look for it. The Museum of London, and its Docklands branch in particular, now holds a considerable share of what the Thames foreshore has given up over the past 2 centuries, cabinets of clay pipes, buckles, coins, and small personal objects arranged behind glass with careful labels noting a probable date and, where it can be determined, a probable original owner's trade or station. A modern visitor can walk past those cabinets in an afternoon, admire the neat rows of Georgian buttons and Tudor pins, and leave with a pleasant, faintly romantic sense of the river's long memory, without ever encountering the word Bermondsey or the word tannery, or any indication that a considerable number of the objects on display were handled, sorted, and eventually lost again by children working a trade the museum's own wall text tends to summarize in a single polite sentence. That is not a failure of the museum so much as a structural feature of how history gets packaged for public consumption. The object survives beautifully, and the labor that surrounded it, the cold, the danger, the 3p a day, does not fit easily onto a small printed card beside a display case. What the mud actually preserved, across the century and a half between Ada's own morning and the present day, turns out to be a peculiar kind of historical gift, offered entirely by accident. The same anaerobic, oxygen-starved conditions that made the foreshore's deeper mud so dangerous to a trapped leg also made it an extraordinary preservative for organic and metal material that would have rotted or corroded away almost anywhere else, sealing away clay pipes, leather shoes, coins, and countless other small fragments of ordinary Victorian life in conditions close to ideal for their survival. The very ground that nearly killed children like Ada has also, in the long run, kept an unusually honest record of exactly the world she lived in. A record considerably more complete and considerably less filtered than the polished nocturnes and approving newspaper columns of 1880 ever intended to leave behind. There is something worth holding on to in this particular irony as we step back now from the details of Ada's trade and consider what all of it, taken together, actually reveals about the London that produced it. Step back far enough from any single morning on the Bermondsey foreshore, and a handful of larger patterns begin to emerge. Patterns that reach considerably beyond one child, one river, or one trade. The first is this. Every great civic improvement this story has touched on, Bazalgette's sewers, the granite embankment, the steady expansion of London's docks, was, without exception, a genuine and considerable achievement, engineered by serious people solving real problems for a city that badly needed them solved. And every one of those same achievements, examined closely enough, produced a second effect its designers never accounted for and rarely noticed once the ribbon had been cut and the newspapers had filed their approving reports. The sewers that saved the city from cholera also produced, in the closed brick tunnels under its streets, a new and largely unaddressed hazard of trapped gas that a different family in a different corner of this same London had to learn to live beside. The embankment that gave the fashionable stretches of the river their granite promenade also, over the following decades, quietly erased the working foreshore that families like the Pells depended on for their very bread. Progress in Victorian London arrived again and again as a genuine gift to some and a genuine, if largely unrecorded, cost to others, and the same newspapers that celebrated the gift rarely thought to ask who was quietly paying for it. The second pattern concerns visibility itself and how selectively this era chose to look at its own body, its own labour, and its own waste. A gentleman strolling the embankment in 1880 could admire the river's newly odourless surface without ever once being required to think about the tunnels under his feet, the tanneries downstream, or the children working the exposed mud a few miles further along the same water. This was not simple ignorance, the innocent not knowing of a person who had never encountered the relevant facts. It was something closer to a collective, only partly conscious agreement, upheld across every stratum of comfortable society, to look past exactly the kind of labour and suffering that made the comfortable version of the city possible in the first place. Mayhew's entire body of work exists as a direct, deliberate rebuttal to that agreement, a refusal to keep looking past what everyone else had trained themselves not to see, and the fact that his account remains, a century and a half later, essentially the primary source for this entire story, tells you something sobering about how few of his contemporaries made the same choice. The third pattern lives in the Mudlark's own resourcefulness, and it deserves to be named plainly rather than folded quietly into the general sadness of the story, because it is not, in the end, a sad detail at all. Ada Pell and Sarah Coyle possessed, between them, an extraordinary body of hands-on knowledge. Hydrology without the vocabulary of hydrology. Toxicology without a single word of chemistry. A working understanding of tidal timing precise enough to keep two people alive across thousands of individual low tides in a genuinely lethal environment. None of it was taught in any school. None of it was written down, certified, or recognized by any institution with the power to call it expertise. It was, nonetheless, exactly that, a sophisticated and hard-won body of applied science, developed and refined across generations of people the wider culture dismissed, when it thought of them at all as little more than scavengers and petty thieves. The gap between what Ada and Sarah actually knew and what polite London assumed they knew is, in its own quiet way, one of the most revealing gaps in this entire story. And the fourth pattern, perhaps the one most worth carrying forward, concerns the sheer ordinary courage this trade required of the people living it. A courage that never announced itself as courage because nobody involved had the luxury of framing their own life in such dramatic terms. Ada did not wake at 3:30 each low tide because she was brave in any conscious sense. She woke because the tide was turning, because her family needed what the mud might yield, and because that was simply what a morning required of a girl in her particular position. Sarah did not walk this same foreshore for 4 decades because she had made some deliberate decision to endure hardship with dignity. She walked it because it was, for a woman of her age and circumstances, very nearly the only door still open to her. and she walked through it with whatever steadiness her body could still manage. Courage, examined closely enough, very often turns out to look exactly like this, unglamorous, unremarked, and simply repeated, tide after tide, for as long as it has to be. Taken together, these 4 patterns describe something larger than one family's ordinary Tuesday on one particular stretch of the Bermondsey foreshore. They describe the way a truly great and immensely wealthy civilization solves its most visible problems while quietly generating new, less visible ones in their place, and the way it then proceeds, almost without exception, to forget entirely that anyone paid a real price for either the solving or the generating, until a careful enough record, kept by a patient enough witness, forces that price back into view a century and a half later. It is worth pausing, before we leave the mud entirely, on the particular distance between Ada's Tuesday and whatever ordinary Tuesday you yourself happen to be lying somewhere warm and dry inside right now. You very likely woke this morning to water that arrives clean at the turn of a tap, in a room heated without a fire that needs feeding by hand, wearing shoes that keep every hazard of a street or a riverbank at a comfortable remove from the soles of your feet. A cut, for you, is a minor inconvenience managed with a bandage and, if it truly warrants it, a course of medicine that did not exist in any form in 1880 and that ends an infection Ada's century could only watch and hope past. None of this makes your own life easy in whatever particular ways it is actually hard. It simply means that the specific, grinding, day-by-day negotiation with cold, filth, and physical danger that governed literally every waking hour of Ada Pell's childhood has receded, for most people fortunate enough to be hearing this sentence, into something closer to an abstraction, a fact read about rather than a fact lived inside. That distance is worth noticing occasionally, not as a source of guilt which helps no one, living or dead, but as a source of plain and accurate perspective, a reminder of how recently, in the very long span of human history, an ordinary Tuesday morning for an ordinary 9-year-old girl in one of the wealthiest cities on earth could still mean 6 hours barefoot in freezing, contaminated mud, and how much of what now separates that morning from this one was won, slowly and unevenly, by exactly the kind of engineering, reform, and plain accumulated medical knowledge this account has spent its length describing. Return, for a final time, to the collector on Bond Street, still holding his small framed nocturne up toward the window light, still admiring the silvered water and the fog the colour of a pigeon's wing, and the string of barges riding their own trembling reflections in the middle distance. Nothing about the painting itself has changed. The ochre smudge still sits along the bottom edge of the canvas, exactly where the artist placed it. The 3 or 4 tiny dark figures worked into that smudge are still there too, unchanged, unremarked, exactly as easy to overlook as they were at the very beginning of this account. What has changed is everything you now know about what those few commas of paint actually contain. You know that the mud they represent could close around a child's leg within seconds and hold her fast against a returning tide with a force her own strength alone was often not enough to break. You know that the water lapping at that same mud carried, on any given morning, a shifting mixture of human sewage, industrial chemical runoff from the gasworks and tanneries lining both banks, and the bacteria responsible for typhoid. All of it settling into ground that a 9-year-old girl waded through barefoot for 6 hours at a stretch, twice a day, because her family's rent and bread depended on whatever she and the tide between them could manage to produce. You know about the broken glass and the rusted iron capable of opening her foot to the bone, and about the tetanus and blood poisoning that followed exactly that kind of wound, often enough that every mudlark on the river had learned to watch a fresh cut with real and immediate dread. You know that a solidly good morning's find, gathered at that level of risk, might buy a single loaf of bread. You know that the same river occasionally gave back London's own dead, and that finding one was, strange as it might sound to a comfortable modern ear, simply one more part of an ordinary working morning, handled with a steadiness that had nothing to do with indifference and everything to do with accumulated, necessary practice. You know, too, about Ada Pell, who at the very moment this collector admires his painting is very likely still asleep after a long morning on the mud, curled in the single room she shares with her mother, her father, and 3 younger siblings, her small tin box of worthless treasures tucked somewhere close at hand. You know about Sarah Coyle, whose 4 decades on this same stretch of river have left her with a stiff knee, a missing finger, and a body of knowledge about tides, mud, and danger that no institution in London ever thought to certify, record, or thank her for. You know that within Ada's own lifetime, the very foreshore she is standing on this particular Tuesday will begin to disappear under paving stones and dock walls she cannot yet imagine, closing off, gradually and almost silently, the one trade that has kept her family fed through every thin week this account has described. None of this makes the collector wrong to enjoy his painting, or naive for not knowing what an entire evening's careful attention has spent itself explaining. He is simply experiencing, exactly as the dealer who sold it to him intended, the visible half of a river whose considerably less visible half required Ada's scarred foot, Sarah's wheezing chest, and the largely unrecorded labour of hundreds of children and old people spread across every working stretch of the Thames. The painting's beauty was not a lie. Exactly. It was, more precisely, a very careful and very selective kind of honesty, true as far as it went, and silent about everything it left out of the frame. There is something clarifying about knowing this. The next time a river, any river, running quiet and silvered through the middle of a great city, strikes you as simply beautiful, simply picturesque, simply a pleasant backdrop for an evening walk, you are looking, more often than the comfortable version of any city's history likes to admit, at a working surface with an entire second life moving under it. A life that was, for people very much like Ada Pell and Sarah Coyle, never picturesque at all, only necessary, only difficult, and only theirs to manage with whatever the century had actually given them to manage it. Ada Pell is not a smudge of ochre paint at the bottom of somebody's nocturne, and neither is Sarah, and neither, in her turn, will Ada's own children be when this same river, considerably tamer and considerably more regulated by then, no longer requires quite the same kind of desperate courage from the people living along its banks. They are people in complicated, cold, frequently injured bodies, managing an unforgiving physical world with whatever tools their circumstances actually gave them. A twist of instinct for reading dangerous mud, a small tin box of treasures kept for no reason but wanting them. A hand held tight on the walk down a set of worn stone steps in the dark. None of it was foolish. None of it was primitive, in the faintly condescending sense that word so often carries when it gets applied backward across a century and a half of comfortable hindsight. It was resourceful, hard-won, and built entirely from the best information and the most workable materials a family in their particular position actually had available to them, which is very nearly the definition of what every ordinary family in every century has always had to do with the physical world it was born into. The candle has burned low on this particular story now, the way it burns low on every evening eventually, and the small painting this account opened with, a river at dawn, silvered and quiet and beautiful, is still hanging exactly where it always hung, still composed, still telling only the half of the story it was ever painted to show. You see it differently now, though, and that difference is not a small thing. Somewhere under that silvered water and that ochre smudge of paint, mistaken by a century of comfortable viewers for nothing more than atmosphere, an entire hidden world of tides, sinks, broken glass, and quiet, unglamorous courage, kept a 9-year-old girl and an old woman fed through one more thin week of an unforgiving century, largely unseen, almost entirely unthanked, and every bit as real as anything the painting ever showed you. Sleep well.